continue to prepare ourselves for your return. So we ask that you would please oversee all the things that we do tonight. The time that we spend together, please guide us and encourage us. Help us to be enthused, to be excited about the blessings that we have from you every day, and especially our time together tonight. So we start our meeting and our gathering together tonight in prayer, and we come to you through Jesus Christ's name. Amen. All right. It's a bit bizarre just standing up here. I'm sort of a bit more nervous tonight, having no one here than having a crowd full of people in front of me.
I'm here.
Tonight. Thanks, John. It's great to have you here, John, and Simon's also here, buzzing around, getting organised. So, welcome to everyone who's joining us tonight, whether you're in your lounge chair or your kitchen table, on your phone, on your computer, on your TV, whatever means you are joining us tonight. It's great that we can all be here. We're going to introduce John's words to us tonight in our reading. Our reading is going to be taken from Isaiah 19. And we're going to read from verse 1 through to verse 15. So reading with you now from Isaiah chapter 19, verse 1 to 15. The burden of Egypt, behold, Yahweh rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come unto Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at the presence of the heart of Egypt, shall melt in the midst of it. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight, every one against his brother, and every one against his neighbour, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. And the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the counsel thereof. And they shall seek unto the idols and to the charmers, and to them that have familiar spirits, and to the wizards. And the Egyptians will I give over to the hand of the cruel Lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts. And the waters shall fail from the sea, and the rivers shall be wasted and dried up. And they shall turn the rivers far away, and the brooks of defence shall be emptied and dried up. The reeds and flags shall wither. The paper reeds by the brooks, by the mouth of the brooks, and everything sown by the brooks shall wither, be driven away, and be no more. The fishers shall also mourn, and all they that cast angle into the brooks, and lament, and they shall spread nets upon the waters, shall languish. Moreover, they that work in fine flax, and they that weave networks shall be confounded, and they shall be broken in the purpose thereof. All that makes, I don't know what that word is, and ponds for fish. Surely the princes of Zion are fools, and counsel of the wise, counsellors of Pharaoh, it becometh brutish. But say ye unto Pharaoh, I am the son of the wise, the son of the ancient kings. Where are they? Where are thy wise men? And let them tell thee now, and let them know that Yahweh of hosts hath purposed upon Egypt. The kings of Zion are become fools, the princes of Nerth are deceived, and have also seduced Egypt, even they that stay in the tribes thereof. Yahweh hath mingled a perverse spirit in the midst thereof, and they have caused Egypt to err in every work thereof, as a drunken man staggereth in his vomit. Neither shall there be any work in Egypt, which the head or tail, branch or rush may do. Alright, I'd like to hand over now to John as he leads us tonight around the subject, the smiting and healing of Egypt.
Thanks, Brother Jason, and good evening, my dear brothers and sisters of our Lord Jesus Christ. It is definitely an interesting feeling to be standing here and only looking out on two beautiful faces, Jason and Simon. But thankfully we live in an age where we can do this, and so Despite not being able to gather together, we can do it in spirit and through technology. So, we've got 2 classes ahead of us. Tonight is the first of 2, so it's the Smiting and Healing of Egypt, and it breaks right in the center. Tonight we're dealing with the Smiting of Egypt, and tomorrow we are dealing, not tomorrow, next class we're dealing with the Healing of Egypt. Now, the purpose of our class this evening, and it comes, I suppose, at an opportune time, is to remember that God is in control of everything. It's pretty tough out there right now with things changing, with COVID-19, with issues with work and employment and all sorts of things. But the reality is something as big as this can be nothing other than God. God is in control. And despite how challenging it is, hopefully as we look at the prophecy of Isaiah 19 tonight, we will be encouraged through reflection of this prophecy that God is truly in control and that these things are taking place to allow us time to prepare for the imminent return of our Lord Jesus Christ. So, we want to look firstly, thanks Simon, power hasn't gone out, it's okay. We've got a rogue operative in the back turning lights on and off on me. So we want to start off by looking at Isaiah 19 and verse 1 to get a little bit of context of what this prophecy is all about. So Isaiah 19 and verse 1. And we're told that this prophecy is all about the burden of Egypt. Now, this is interesting because we all know that a burden is something to be carried, something that you lay upon someone to be carried. It's something that's heavy, something that needs to be lifted. But the idea of the word burden, it comes from the root nasa, which, as we know, is something heavy, requiring lifting. But the lifting has to be done by somebody capable of lifting. And when we look at the burden of Egypt, what we're being told straight away is that this chapter is about a heavy weight that is placed upon Egypt by God, and that heavy weight will only be lifted off of Egypt by God. This is not something that Egypt is going to bear and struggle under and kind of keep walking and plodding and making it work. This is a burden which is unliftable by Egypt. And only God is going to be able to lift the burden which he himself has placed upon Egypt. So, why is this burden placed upon Egypt? Well, I've turned to the wrong part of my Bible. I'm in Daniel for some reason, not in Isaiah. So when we look at Isaiah 19, we're told that it's the burden placed upon Egypt, and this burden is, behold, Yahweh rides upon a swift cloud and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of thee. Now, this isn't necessarily really highlighting the burden yet. This is highlighting the big picture that God wants to reveal to us in Isaiah 19. The big picture is something a little bit different than specifically the burden. The big picture right now that God is dealing with is there's going to be a burden, there's going to be something heavy placed upon Egypt that needs to be lifted by God. He also tells us that there is this swift cloud that he's going to ride into Egypt upon. So we have a swift cloud identified for us. And we know that this swift cloud is the same language that's used in Revelation 10. And it is the saints. It is the vehicles upon which God, or Christ in this case, as God's representative, rides upon. So this vehicle of the cloud, or the rainbow angel as it's called in Revelation 10, is the saints. So you and I are now involved in this prophecy. So God is going to ride into Egypt, or Christ is going to ride into Egypt on the back of us, the rainbow angel, the saints, this cloud of witnesses, as it's referred to in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. So we know that that cloud is referring to a multitude, and it is this rainbow angel. We also have identified for us that it's coming into Egypt. Now this is significant because what we have to realize is that Christ actually goes into Egypt with the rainbow angel. There is a physical descending upon Egypt, which places for us a little bit of a timeline in place. So when we look at the overarching theme of what's happening during Christ coming back to the earth, what we see in the beginning of kind of Christ's return is that, and hopefully you can see everything on the slide, we've got Elijah's ministry, which is going to go out into the world. That's kind of the step one. Within that ministry, Elijah's sent to Jewry, and Elijah's mission is to go all over the world. Now, the second stage is actually that Russia comes down from the north and invades Egypt. Now we know that it's Egypt first. Turn over to Daniel chapter 11, verse 42 for me, please. 42 to 45. And Daniel chapter 11, verse 42 to 45 tells us, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So we know that this is now God stretching forth his hand and reaching different countries. Egypt is not going to escape, but he shall have power over the treasures. Sorry, this is not God. Sorry, Gog, I meant to say. This is Gog coming down from the north, or Gog, as might be more readily available to be understood. So this is Gog coming down from the north. The land of Egypt is not going to escape his tyranny, but he shall have power over the treasures of Egypt and of the silver and over the precious things of Egypt, and Libyans and Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury and destroy and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacle of his palace between the seas of the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. So the reason that we go to this verse is because we want to establish it in order of events. Russia comes down from the north and ends up going into Egypt, and there's some things that we'll discuss a little bit later in the class that might give us some context as to why Russia comes down from the north to settle that score over the Suez Canal crisis and the Aswan Dam. We'll come to that a little bit later. But at this stage, Russia comes down from the north. If you can see it on your screen there, he plants himself in Egypt, and at the same time, Christ is actually moving into the Arab nations. Don't have time to go into that this class, but he's moving into the Arab nations to conquer the Arab nations. This is post-judgment. This is when the army of Christ, you and I, are there as immortalized saints, being the vehicles upon which his glory rides, the rainbow angels, or the rainbow angel, and the different marches as it's noted throughout the scripture. So the next step is, after Russia comes down from the north, and this is now the next slide. Are you able to do that from there, Simon, or we need the next slide? Sorry. Oh, it's on. Cool. Sorry about that. So the next step is Russia, as we read in Daniel 11, hears tidings from the east. So he hears that there's this military campaign, this superhuman army that's overtaken the Arabs, and he hears these tidings from the east. And anybody who's seen Dan Jolley's The Angel's War Room, which was done at Pinjara, and he's done it around the place, you'll realize that idea of supply chains, Russia knowing the power of supply chains, Russia's come down from the north, they retract and they set themselves up in Jerusalem because they need to be able to keep strategic advantage on supply chains and making sure that they have a position where they don't have the head of their army cut off. So Russia retracts, comes back to Jerusalem. Based on what he hears, he's going to secure himself, and at the same time as Russia establishes himself in his own tabernacle in Israel, in the Holy Mountain, in Jerusalem, Christ, with a swift cloud, comes in and goes into Egypt. Now, we believe that this is the case prior to the great battle of Armageddon, because if Christ destroyed Russia first, in Jerusalem, then there would be no need for Egypt to be saved, because Russia will have already been destroyed, and the power and the stranglehold that was upon Egypt would be done away with. So Egypt wouldn't convert and turn to God, which is the whole purpose of this prophecy, as we'll find in a minute. So Russia comes down from the north, retracts to Jerusalem. Christ and a swift cloud. There's a reason that it's a swift cloud. It's a small, easily maneuverable army that goes into Egypt and establishes itself in Egypt to try and help Egypt in their time of crisis. And then Christ comes from Egypt into Jerusalem to overthrow the Gogian Northern Confederacy. So it's important to understand that series of events. So Christ rides on this swift cloud, goes into Egypt. Egypt is retreated by Russia, goes up into Jerusalem, and now we have this position where Christ is in Egypt. But prior to that, prior to Christ going into Egypt, we know that the reason that Christ goes into Egypt is because Egypt is under a great oppressor, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. But if you look at Isaiah 19 and verse 20, Egypt gets to the point under such great oppression that it is crying unto Yahweh because of the oppressors. Now this is one of those moments where the symmetry and the irony and the poetry of God is evident in the Bible. When you look back at Exodus chapter 2 and verse 23, it was Israel that was crying unto God for the reason of their bondage in Egypt. In this case, it's Egypt crying unto God for the reason of their oppressor. And in both cases, Moses comes into Egypt to lead Israel out of Egypt and save them. And in this case, Christ, the greater than Moses, comes into Egypt, riding on the back of this swift cloud, to overthrow the oppression that Egypt is experiencing and to save Egypt. And Egypt actually gets to the point, as we read, if you turn back to Isaiah 19 again, Egypt gets to the point where they are similar to that of Jericho when Israel was in the wilderness about to cross over into the land of promise. And they get to the point where they're like Jericho. The heart of the Egyptians is melting in the midst of them. So they are in such fear, such trembling, such oppression, that the heart of the Egyptians is melting, which is our next slide here. So again, the bigger picture is that God wants to bring Egypt to this point where their heart is melting because of oppression, and where they cry unto God for the reason of their oppressor, because they need God to save them. This is Egypt. This is the iron furnace that burns up faith in the Old Testament and destroys it, and yet God brings them to a point where they cry unto God for salvation. This is an incredible chapter that we're about to embark on, because of all nations in the world, if God can convert Egypt, then he can do anything in the world. He can bring together... Sorry, we're just in the process of plugging in my computer because it's pretty low on battery. And now we have no risk, God willing, of losing battery. So if God can do this for Egypt, then he can do it for any of us and any nation. And so the same environment that existed in Rahab's time, in Joshua 2 verse 11 and Joshua 14 and verse 8, is now the environment that exists in Egypt, with men's hearts melting because of the fear that they're under. And coupled with the idea that Rotherham says in chapter 19 and verse 1 of Isaiah, they are in such turmoil that they are turning to their idols, and their idols will shake at his presence. This is at the presence of Christ, not necessarily the Gogian host. We're not there yet. So Christ comes in riding on this swift cloud because he wants Egypt to get to a point where they're shaking at his presence and that they have removed the idols from their presence. Now, Egypt has a long history of idol worship, being pagan, and in more recent times they've converted in 700 AD to Islam. But all the idols that existed in Egypt's history and in their culture are going to be moved. The actual Rotherham says that the idols of Egypt shall shake at his presence. Now we know that idols don't have feelings, they don't have emotions, so it's not that the idols are shaking, but it's the men that made them. It's the men that set up these ideologies of paganism or Islam that Egypt has taken hold of. And those men are going to shake, and they're going to shake so much that their idols are going to be supplanted by Christ himself. And the purpose, the ultimate purpose of Christ entering into Egypt, placing this burden upon Egypt and removing the burden from Egypt, is so that Egypt gets to a point where it casts off its idols and turns to God for help. Egypt gets to a point where they move away from the idols and they move toward God and his Son. And they have a relationship with God and his Son. And that is what we're going to look at with the smiting and healing of Egypt. God actually opens up this passage in Isaiah 19 with the end result first. He says, this is what is going to happen in the end. Egypt is going to be converted. They're going to cast away all of their idols, and they are going to have a relationship with me because of the intervention of Christ, which is a pretty special moment that we're going to get to in our next session. Now, back in Isaiah 19. Isaiah 19, and we're going to focus now on verses 2 to 4. And what God says he's going to do in Egypt is it's going to be a progression of things that take place where this burden is going to be heavier and heavier and heavier upon Egypt. And the first part of this burden is God says that I will set Egyptian against Egyptian, and they shall fight everyone against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, and district against district, which is what that kingdom against kingdom means. So he's going to turn everybody against each other. Now this has actually already started. So this is not all future-based prophecy in Isaiah 19. The process of the burden being placed upon Egypt has already commenced. And when we think back to the Arab Spring and in the civil uprising that existed in Egypt, it was a civil war like had never been seen in the history of Egypt. Isaiah depicts Egypt in verse 2 as a civil war-torn country with internal struggles and external pressures, as we read in verse 4 later on, those external pressures. And we've seen this scenario start to and commence unfolding in 2011, where we know that there was, like on the streets of Egypt, there was uproar and there was civil unrest and there was an ousting of Hosni Mubarak, who reigned as supreme leader of Egypt, president of Egypt, from 1981 to 2011. 30 years of his reign, and he was ousted because of this civil unrest. The next leader was Mohammed Morsi. He only lasted a year. He was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he was ousted. The most recent leader, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, he has been there a little bit longer. He's been there for going on 6 years now. But we know that the civil unrest in Egypt continues to exist. Just recently, in 2018 and 2019, there was riots on the street, and there's been civil war and civil unrest. If you look at a list of, online, a list of Egypt's wars and skirmishes and things like that they've been involved in, it labels that the civil war commenced in 2011 and it hasn't finished. It's gone on to the present time. So we know that Egypt is already in that position of having civil unrest, of having Egyptian against Egyptian, brother against brother, every man against his neighbor, district against district, and city against city. And we saw it all over the news back in 2011, 12, and 13. But we also know, sorry, we're not there yet, don't change yet. But we also know that as soon as that started to take place, Egypt started to slide, not just civilly and not just as a social construct, but as an economic powerhouse as well. Not that they were ever a powerhouse, sorry, but as an economic situation, Egypt has started to decline quite significantly. And in verse 3, we see that it says that the spirit of Egypt shall fail. The ESV actually says that, and the spirit of the Egyptians within them will be emptied out. So this Egyptian against Egyptian, this civil unrest, actually causes Egypt to start questioning its spirit, and those that are Egyptians to start questioning their spirit. There's a breakdown of the fabric of Egyptian society. Now, I've got a gentleman in my office by the name of Mustafa Mahmoud, and he actually is Egyptian. He's from Egypt, and he moved over around that time when there was civil unrest. And one of the things that he's noted again and again is that prior to the unrest, Egyptians had a strong sense of pride in being Egyptians, whereas now there is this slightly them and us mentality within Egypt and against the governments. So this idea that that the Egyptians within themselves will be emptied out, they will lose that sense of fierce pride that they had of being Egyptian, and society in Egypt will start to break down with this civil war that commenced. And we know that that is the case in Egypt. There is a lot of civil unrest. People have lost their identity as Egyptians, and this was prophesied throughout the pages of Isaiah 19. God continues on and he says, I will destroy the counsel thereof. The ESV actually says, and I will confound their counsels. And what this indicates is that above and beyond the social challenges that the civil war would create for Egypt, they would have governmental collapse. And again, we saw that with the transition from leader to leader. And with that governmental collapse and general confusion, Egypt is going to be left in a position where they're wide open to external intervention. And being in a position of unbalance internally leaves them open to this cruel ruler which is going to come and oppress them. And when we start looking at the history of Egypt, Egypt is a pretty special place on the map. And there's been a lot of interest in Egypt from the United States, from the Arab countries, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Israel over a long period, as well as from Russia. Now, when we look a little bit further into verse 3, it says that they shall seek to the idols and to the charmers. And it seems like, and to the familiar spirits and to the wizards, is what the KJV says. And it seems like things are going to get so bad in Egypt, they're going to turn to any form of religious following that they've had in their past, whether it be idols under the pagan system, whether it be, what does it say here? What was the word? To the charmers, to the familiar spirits, and to the wizards. So they start looking at their pagan past for help. They start looking at their Muslim present for help. And even this word that exists for charmers and wizards is actually applied in Isaiah 8 and verse 19 to the apostasy. So it seems that there's a hint that Egypt may even turn to its Christian supporters or to the Christian community, to the Christian world for help, because their Muslim brothers have just undergone significant significant war when Christ goes in to war against the Arab nations prior to Armageddon as well. So it may look like they even turn to the Christian world for help because their Muslim brothers are preoccupied. Now, the Egyptians will I give over into the hands of a cruel Lord, is what verse 4 says. Now, this is the beginning of what we looked at before with the map, where Russia starts to come down from the north and start to establish itself in Egypt. So we know that this hasn't really commenced on a large scale as yet. So now we're getting into prophecies that are still yet to unfold when it comes to Egypt. So the beginning, the civil unrest and the beginning of destabilizing Egypt has already taken place. We're literally living in the time period of prophecies that relate to the return of Jesus Christ and the period of time where Christ rides on the back of us, his saintly army, to go into Egypt and deliver them. We're living in the commencement of that time period, which is why when we look at Corona around us and COVID-19 and the general issues that exist in the world, we know that it must be close. It must be close, because this is already a period of time that Isaiah has prophesied about in Egypt, this position of destabilization. But then it goes further, and the king of the north, this external power, because of the instability in Egypt, has the ability to come in, descend into Egypt, and start its oppressive rule. Turn back, please, to Daniel chapter 11, where we were just before. And we're going to read a little bit prior to the verses that we read before. So we are going to read from verse 40 now instead of verse 42. So Daniel chapter 11, verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, and with horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. So the king of the north begins his descent, and he's going to overflow and pass over the countries as he comes down from the north. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. So those are the Arab nations that are going to escape out of his hand, that Christ actually comes in and deals with when he has his conflict with the Arab countries. And then, as we read, he will stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So Russia comes down from the north. This internal instability that exists in Egypt is ripe for Russia to come down and plant himself in the middle of Egypt. Now, why is it that Russia is going to come down and invade Egypt? Well, there's some pretty significant history that exists between Russia and Egypt in modern times. This modern-day Assyrian powerhouse and Egypt. And what happened in the 1950s, 1956, is, and leading up to 1956, is Egypt decided to ask for help from the United States, for funding from the United States to build the Aswan Dam. It was going to allow them, and we'll get to this again a little bit later as well, but the Aswan Dam is a dam in the middle of the Nile that allows them to control the flow of water and generate power. It allows them to control watering their fertile countryside. It allows them a strategic position that they didn't have. So they had the lower dam, and this was the upper dam that they wanted to build, but they didn't have the money for it. So they approached the United States. The United States ended up reneging on their promise to provide funding for the Aswan Dam. So Egypt, in turn, ends up going over to Russia. And at the same time, they decided that they wanted to take the Suez Canal under their own control. Now, the Suez Canal, up until this point, in the late 1800s, when the Suez Canal was built, it was controlled by Britain and France. And in 1956, Egypt decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. So war broke out between Egypt and France. The United States caught wind of this. They were pretty unhappy, and Israel. So Egypt, France, and Israel, this trifecta of nations Britain, France, and Israel came against Egypt. The United States kind of hung back. They decided to pull funding from Egypt And Russia steps in and sells guns and ammunitions and supports Egypt with tons of weaponry, as well as funding to be able to build the Aswan Dam during this time as well. And so there's this alliance now between Russia and Egypt. But after the skirmish was over, after Britain, France, and Israel failed to take back control of the Suez Canal, and Egypt remained through the help of Russia, Egypt ended up ousting Russia out of its borders and kicked them out. And so Russia was pretty bitter, and has been for a long time, over the fact that they funded and they supported Egypt in fighting against Britain, France, and Israel, and building the Aswan Dam. And they've never forgotten about that. Russia has a very long memory. So that's a little bit of context as to why Russia may come down from the north. And it's history, so it's there for us to grab hold of, but there may be other reasons as well. But the instability of Egypt ends up leading to Russia invading Egypt and establishing itself in its borders. Now, when Russia comes down and commences its cruel rule over say that 3 times fast. Its cruel rule over Egypt. The Egyptian society and economic system just starts to crumble. So we're going to pick up this from Isaiah 19 verses 5 to 10, where we're told that the Egyptian industry, which has largely been reliant on those 2 waterways, the Nile and in more recent times the Suez Canal, is going to be under significant pressure. So look at verse 5, where God, I just love how detailed God can be throughout prophecy. And the waters shall fail from the sea, and the river shall be wasted and dried up. So there's 2 waterways that are specifically identified here. The water that fails between the sea and the water that fails from the river. Now, we're going to have a little bit of context as to how important these 2 waterways, the Suez Canal and the Nile River, are to Egypt. When you look at the slide in front of you, the Suez Canal is an artificial sea level waterway in Egypt, connecting the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea through the Isthmus of Suez. It really defines the borders between Asia and Africa. And it was constructed, for a little bit of history, it was constructed in 1859, between 1859 and 1869, by the Suez Canal Company, which at the time was controlled by Britain, by the UK, and France. It's a more direct passage between the North Atlantic and the Northern Indian Ocean via the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. So they carved out, as you can see on the slide, they carved out this land to allow the waterway to continue. It saves a significant amount of time when it comes to ocean travel. If you're traveling from the Arabian Sea to London, the distance reduced by going through the Suez Canal is 8,900 kilometers. That is a huge amount of time and cost that is saved. So this is a very, very significant waterway. When you look at it, sorry, I keep pointing to the board, which nobody's in the audience to look at with me. But when you look at it on the map there, you can see that it just comes right up and carves right through the middle of Egypt. And you've got a satellite view there as well, so that you can kind of see where it goes. Now, the northern terminus is Port Said, and the southern terminus, Port, I'm not even going to try that one, Tufik, at the city of Suez. The length of the canal is only 193 kilometers, as opposed to the round trip of having to go an extra 8,900 kilometers in some of those cases for heavily traveled ocean routes. And there's over 8,000 vessels that traverse the canal yearly. That's a huge amount. That's 50 per day that cut through the Suez Canal. So no wonder Britain and France didn't want to lose control of this waterway. Whoever controls this waterway actually controls the flow of goods and services back and forth between pretty much the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans and all the that sit on each side. It generates 30% of Egypt's GDP. So the canal is directly related to 30% of Egypt's GDP. That is huge. Now, the Aswan Dam is the control of the flow of water through the Nile. And the Aswan Dam, as you can see up here, based on the success of the lower dam, then at its maximum utilization they constructed the high dam. It became a key objective for the government following the Egyptian Revolution in 1952, with the ability to better control flooding, provide increased water storage for irrigation, and generate hydroelectricity. If you have any questions about that, Uncle Nathan Edwards will be able to give you more information on how that works. The dam was seen as pivotal to Egypt's planned industrialization. Like the earlier implementation of the high dam has had a significant effect on the economy and the culture of Egypt. So God specifically mentions these two waterways that are the main sources of income for Egypt. Now, when you start looking at these two waterways, after the army deposed longtime President Hosni Mubarak in 2011, amid the Arab Spring protests and ensuing political instability, ultimately led the army to oust Mubarak's elected but increasingly unpopular successor. So this goes back to Egyptian against Egyptian in the civil unrest. Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. Under a new constitution, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was elected to a 4-year term in 2014 and re-elected in 2018. Constitutional amendments approved in April 2019 strengthened presidential authority, get this, to allow him to serve as president, or rule as president, I should say, until 2030, another 10 years instead of an elected period of 4 years. But all of that is interesting. The flow on of that is that most economic activity takes place in the highly fertile Nile Valley. Despite sporadic terrorist attacks, the vital tourism industry has rebounded, but Egypt remains dependent on aid from Saudi Arabia and the international financial institutions. So this is not, history saying that Egypt is reliant on the Nile. This is the Heritage Organization 2020 Index of Economic Freedom. So Egypt has managed to bounce back a little bit from its instability based on the prosperity of the Nile and of the Suez Canal. When you end up looking further, Egypt's Suez Canal reports record high 5.5 billion annual revenue in 2018. And again, another headline that says Egypt sees the Suez Canal zone making up to 30 to 35% of the economy. So that's a huge amount of emphasis that's on these two waterways. And this is exactly what God says is going to suffer under the oppression of the despotic ruler, the Gogian host, the king of the north. So, what we see in Isaiah 19 verses 5 to 10, sorry for that diversion with history, but it paints a good picture for us, that God names both of these waterways in Isaiah, where Isaiah predicts the total collapse of Egypt's economy. Egypt will be thoroughly humbled by a depression, and the following conditions are gradually felt. Commerce, which in Egypt depends upon the waterways, comes to a grinding halt and figuratively dries up. Egypt will be isolated from help. Its canals will silt up. Poverty will become acute. That's what, and I'm just summarizing what verses 5 to 10 say. The vital fields of the floodplains of the Nile will be left uncultivated because Egypt will be under such pressure and such oppression from from Russia. Egypt's important fishing industry will go into decline and eventually ruin, is what Isaiah tells us in Isaiah 19. Egypt's craft and industry will close down. The depression is going to strike all classes, rich and poor, and the general calamity will bring Egypt to its knees. So if we think that the global situation that we're experiencing with COVID-19 is bringing us to our knees, it's going to be compounded in Egypt. It's going to get even worse when Russia comes down from the north and takes over. And that's going to lead to really silly decisions that Egypt makes as a government, right? How are we going to deal with this instability, with this oppression? And we're told in verses 11 to 15, we're summarizing for the sake of time here, that the economic meltdown and the collapse is going to be obviously linked to Russia coming down and being a despot, but it's also linked to the government making silly and wasteful decisions under Russia's rule. So in verse 11, the handling of the nation's affairs is going to be brutish. So it's going to be consumed, so that they're just going to have waste coming out their ears because they haven't had, they've been living in relative prosperity, and now under the despot they have no ability to fine-tune their systems. There's going to be a failure of wisdom amongst Egypt's ruling class. The rulers in ancient times in Egypt were renowned for the advice that they gave Pharaoh, and now there's going to be an inability to perceive what's going on here. There's this sense of foolishness that prevails in verse 13. Sorry, in verse 12. In verse 13, there's a breakdown of effective government through the selfishness of the ruling class. So again, what we can probably expect to see is that when Russia comes down, it will establish a puppet government. Those at the top are going to be well looked after because that's what normally happens. You know, the rich and the greedy in rulership end up having their pockets lined by Russia, the real superpower behind the country at that point, and the general people will end up suffering. There will be inefficiency, there will be poor decision making, there will be selfishness from the ruling class. And in verse 14, as we read of Isaiah 19, it says that Yahweh is going to mingle a perverse spirit in the midst thereof, and they have caused Egypt to err in every work thereof, as a drunken man staggereth in his own vomit. So what we're told is that this mingling spirit of rulers is going to be planted there by God, and they're going to exploit the inefficiencies, the selfishness, and the irrationality to bring to pass. Sorry, God is going to exploit the inefficiencies, the selfishness, and the irrationality to bring to pass his purpose with Egypt. Now, this is the first class, so it's kind of negative. Not necessarily negative. We're looking at history, and it's exciting to see God's hand at work here. But what we see is a country that is brought to its knees. It's a country that God is exploiting to get them to a point where their hearts melt, where they're under a despotic leadership, where their entire economic stability, where their entire economic system becomes unstable, inefficient, and that there's only a few select that are planted there, we assume, by Russia, that are rulers at the top, and that are taking all the money, and the entire nation is going to be in poverty, is going to be in confusion, is going to be in social collapse, internal warfare, and they are going to be brought to their knees and humbled significantly. Now, that's the first half. The second half that we look at in our next class is going to be the healing of Egypt, and that's a pretty exciting topic when we start looking at how God is going to use Egypt to be able to return his people to his land, which is a pretty exciting thought. So, in summary, God is in control of the world around us, brothers and sisters. History is an exciting way to be able to see the plan of God unfolding, and hopefully, if you didn't know some of that history, although we've shot through it at 1,000,000 miles an hour, there is some pretty exciting history there that teaches us that God is in control and that he has a plan that's unfolding. The events that directly relate to the coming of Christ have already begun. Egypt and the situation that they're in now is exactly what Isaiah is telling us about in Isaiah 19 verses 2, 3, and 4 prior to Russia coming down from the north. We can be encouraged by this, brothers and sisters, that God is in control, that he has commenced the process. But also, in a very uncertain time like today, I'm becoming more and more convinced that God is using this situation of pretty much world collapse to be able to offer us a gracious few moments prior to Christ's return, to refocus, to have quiet time together as families and as ecclesias, to start getting more of his word into our minds, to start getting excited about the Bible again if we've been distracted, to start getting excited about what's going on in the world around us. And God is using this to bring the whole world to its knees, but he's using it to give us a little reminder that this may be our last chance. This may be what we need to get our house in order prior to Christ coming and knocking at our doors. And brothers and sisters, let's use this time as wisely as we can. Let's try and make sure that we get ourselves immersed in our family environments, in our ecclesial environments, even though we can't necessarily be with each other as much as we'd like in person in the flesh. Let's make sure that we're still communicating. Let's make sure that we're doing everything that we can to be ready for the coming of Christ, because Isaiah 19 is so exciting. It is already begun. Now it's just to that next stage of seeing Russia come down from the north. And brothers and sisters, you and I, God willing, we won't be here to see that. We will be here to chase Russia out of Egypt and back up into Jerusalem as a part of that swift cloud that Christ rides upon. But we won't necessarily see Russia come down from the north. And that's the next part of Isaiah 19 that needs to unfold. And then, brothers and sisters, you and I get to be a part of establishing Egypt. I keep saying Israel, sorry about that. You and I get to be a part of establishing Egypt as a healed nation for the teaching of the whole world, which we're going to look at in our next class.
Thanks very much, John. It's a great subject to be contemplating, isn't it? To think about these things, to understand those things that are coming to pass as we wait for Jesus Christ's return. I was thinking on the way here in relation to these events that we'll see leading up to the return of Christ, and I don't know about you, but in my mind it's always been maybe a war, or maybe like a terrorist attack, or something big and dramatic that will bring nations and put them all on edge and bring people's minds to God. When I was a kid, it was always the crazy thunderstorm, the thunder and lightning storm. That was always going to bring Christ's return. But I don't know about you. These are the sort of things that I pictured. I never would have thought that it was going to be a little microscopic speck that was placed in one of the most populated countries in the world that would bring so much trial and so much tumult to the world that we're seeing now. Some really great things to think on, great things to contemplate as we go away for the rest of our week and come back again next Sunday, God willing. The announcements will be emailed around, as Simon has so diligently been doing. We're grateful for that, and thanks, Simon, for your efforts. So we're going to close our night tonight with a prayer, if you'll just bow your heads. Yahweh, our great God, we thank you so much for the ability to get together tonight, the opportunity to contemplate those times that will ultimately lead towards your Son's return back to this earth. As we look around us, we can really see that man, that governments are just, they're nothing stacked up against you, and their best endeavours just don't stand a chance against your plans and your purpose with this earth. We're experiencing troubles in the world that we've never seen before. It's exciting for us, it's daunting, it's uncertain. Please help us to stay strong during these times, to allow us to be guided by you, to allow you to guide us in our lives. There's people that we know that are struggling, that are finding it difficult through whatever circumstances they might be, and we pray for them. We pray for those that need your assistance and your guidance throughout their lives. All of us, we want to be focused and we want to concentrate on those things that are really important to us. So help our mindset, help our resolve, we pray. We're so grateful for the opportunity we've had tonight to be together, to think about you. We're so grateful and thankful for the plan and purpose that you have for this world. We're all blessed, and we certainly are grateful. So we close our time together tonight through prayer, through your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ.